But there is good news, and the good news is that we care. People care. Carnists care. Yes, even carnists care. I've been speaking and teaching about meat production for nearly 2 decades, and I have never once come across a single person who doesn't cringe when faced with images of animals suffering. We care about animals, and we care about the truth, and carnism depends on our not caring, and the system is based on deception. The carnism it's a house of cards. It's a fractured and fragmented system that needs a strong fortress to protect itself from its very own proponents. I mean, why else would people need to go through such mental gymnastics to eat animals, if not because they care? And history shows us again and again that when we make that connection, when we close the gap in our consciousness, that we are willing to stand up and fight against all forms of cruelty and injustice. So, moving beyond carnism, it requires that we bear witness, as all of you have chosen to do. Bearing witness means being willing to see the truth with our eyes as well as with our hearts. And if you think about it, throughout the history of humankind, virtually every atrocity has been made possible because a populace turned away from a reality that they felt was too painful to face. And virtually every revolution, every social transformation was made possible because a group of people chose to bear witness and demanded that others bear witness as well. When we bear witness, we close that gap in our consciousness. We become more integrated. And integration is the goal, according to many psychological and spiritual traditions, the goal of human development. Integration between body, mind, spirit, id, ego, superego, self and other, personal and political. Perhaps not surprisingly, it shares a root with the word integrity, which by definition is the integration of values and practices. So moving beyond carnism requires that we have a paradigm shift, a whole shift of the way that we think about and see the world. It requires that we move from a society, a system of dishonesty, to authenticity, from apathy to empathy, from mindlessness to mindfulness, from complacency to compassion, and from ignorance to awareness. So clearly, carnism and veganism or vegetarianism have very different goals. The goal of carnistic industry is to maintain carnistic numbing. And the goal of vegetarian or vegan advocacy is to transform numbing to witnessing. The whole system of carnism is organized to prevent witnessing on an individual level as well as on a social level. So our question, is how can we be active, effective witnesses and get others to do this as well? And, as you've probably all figured out, you can't force somebody to change. But we certainly can create an environment which increases the likelihood that our message will be heard the way that we've intended it to. So I'm going to briefly go over some strategies to talk about ways that we can do this, and I'm trying to be mindful of the time here as we started a little bit late. Now, one important fact is to not expect the facts to sell the ideology. So often we think, if only the carnists knew the truth, they'd never be able to eat meat or animals again. But as you may be all too well aware, more often than not, this is not the case. And we can find ourselves frustrated, exasperated, wondering what kind of a psychopath we're dealing with. And then we end up pushing harder with the facts and the truth. What happens to you when you push harder?
They resist.
They push back. It increases carnistic defenses. Expect defensiveness. The system is organized around defenses. So we need to be careful to speak to the carnist, not to his or her defenses. It's so easy for us, for instance, to get caught up in a battle of justifications, with our, what ifs and yes buts. Well, what if you had to kill the animal yourself? Would you eat meat then? Or, well, yes, but we wouldn't have to worry about what to do with all the animals if everyone went vegan, because we wouldn't be breeding them in the first place. Some justifications we need to address. If somebody really believes they're going to sicken and die without their meat, well then they need to be made aware that that's not going to happen. But we have to remember that carnism is it's a system of victimization, pitting us against them in a divide and conquer strategy that works against all of us. I mean, the goal of the vegan movement is to attract a critical mass of supporters. And there's no way that we can do that if we see the very people we're reaching out to as the enemy. So we need to recognize that carnism is this psychological system that we're dealing with, a mindset. And so we need to appreciate that asking someone to stop eating meat is not simply asking for a change of behavior, but for a shift of consciousness. We're asking a person to start thinking of themselves as a strand in the web of life, rather than standing atop the so-called hierarchical ladder of life. We're asking them to risk being marginalized or ostracized from their friends and family. We're asking them to open up to the reality of the overwhelming animal suffering in this world. And once you really take in that truth, your life is never the same. Your innocence is lost. You carry that awareness around with you wherever you go. Being vegan or vegetarian is in many ways tremendously empowering, but it also makes us outsiders in other ways. We have to live in a world where we're constantly misunderstood, where every single day our deepest sensibilities are offended. We can start to dread family get-togethers that we used to look forward to. I've seen relationships fall apart, and this doesn't have to happen, but I have seen it happen. So it's very important for us to remember that people don't change unless they're psychologically ready to. We're not just saying stop eating meat. We're saying change your life in some pretty fundamental ways. Take some real risks. Now, we can't create a psychological readiness in a person's life, but we can create a psychological environment that helps them feel safe enough to communicate with us. And one way we do this is to practice separating character from behavior. In other words, we can think of eating animals as something bad, as something evil. It doesn't make the person doing it bad or evil. Your character is beyond just your behavior. Good people do bad things all the time. Many carnists are loving fathers and sisters and brothers and daughters. They're great humanitarians. They're community leaders. They're spiritual teachers. So we need to remember good people can do and do bad things. If we don't remember this, we can fall into the trap of what I refer to as reductive thinking. Reductive thinking is when we reduce a person in our mind to nothing more than a behavior or a set of behaviors. And if you've ever driven in Boston, this happens in about 30 seconds when you get on the road. That person who inevitably cuts you off the minute you're in your car is no longer a person who has a life that matters to them, who has loved and lost and grieved and laughed. They're just that jerk driver on the road. When it comes to relating to carnists, we often do this psychologically, automatically, especially if we're dining with them. We can transform them in our minds from this to this. So we need to appreciate that, view carnists as individuals first, to not reduce somebody to simply, to not, let somebody's carnism define them. They're more than their carnism. I'm more than my veganism. I'm a vegan. My life is very much organized around my veganism, but that's not all of who I am. That's only a part of who I am. And as a vegan, like many of you, I have much more in common with many carnists than I do with many vegans and vegetarians. So we also need to be careful not to internalize carnism. Now, all of you here, to some degree, probably a large degree, have stepped outside of the system. But because it's the dominant system, we can't avoid its impact. It's sort of like becoming aware of advertising. Like me, I teach classes on consumerism, and I'm wearing Gap. I mean, it still affects your self-image. So carnism still impacts us. So don't buy into the negative messages that you hear